Hi everyone, myself Anju here. Now we are going to discuss about the service account, which is using that, the cluster role and the cluster binding. So earlier we discussed about the service account. In that we discussed about the role and the role binding. So difference between role and the cluster role. The role is used for only the namespace scope, and the cluster role is works on the cluster wide inside. In the sense, inside the cluster, what are the resources we have, all we can be accessed, even if you're using the cluster. Okay, and to bind that, the cluster role with we can use a cluster role binding. So let's see how to use that. We'll see that. So I'll show you a diagram, which is already we discussed. So here we can see that the Kubernetes API server, which is actually talking to a pod. So pod we can see at the bottom, and in between there is a service account it's been used. So service account is actually having that the RBAC role and the role binding. So here we are going to use, instead of role and the role binding, we are going to use the role cluster role and the cluster role binding. So when the pod actually getting this token and the CS certificate with the help of service account, which is used for authenticating and authorization to the Kube API server. Okay, so let's see that the practically here in this Kubernetes server. So in that we are going to see that how to configure that the service account as a separate service account, and we'll be using that. So the first thing I'm going to create a service account manually. Here, a file I need to create a manifest file, a service account .yaml. In that I can just put that configurations detail. So API version is v1 and the kind is service account metadata. The name of the service account, it's called cluster-pod-reader-a SA, and the namespace, which this service account is created in the default namespace. And once we created that, we can create that ls kubectl apply -f service account .yaml, so that we can see that kubectl get cluster, sorry, as a service account. We can see that there is a service account created with the name called cluster pod reader -sa. So we can say kubectl describe and SA cluster -pod reader -sa, so that we can see that information about that. We can see the name of the service account, and it's created in a default namespace. The rest all are none here. Okay. So once we created the service account, we are going to create the cluster role and the cluster binding. So in the cluster role, as we discussed earlier, same way, we need to say that what all the resources can be accessed, right? And in the cluster role binding, we need to say that which service account and which role are part of this, and that information will be added in the service cluster role binding. So next I'm going to create the cluster role. So I have to say another file cluster role.yaml. In that I can say that which resource, what is the permission being used. So here also the same thing. The API version is RBAC authorization.k-test.io/v1. And the cluster role, the name, the kind, and the metadata is the name of this cluster role. And the API group, we are using the same, the core group. And the pods, the resource, and the verbs, we are using get and list. So we should be able to see that pods by using the list or get command, so that we can view the pods detail, right? So that is the intention of creating this role cluster. Next, we can create the kubectl apply -f cluster have role.yaml. So we can say kubectl get cluster role here. So we can see here there are many. So we can just check for the name what we created. So we can say kubectl describe cluster row space and the name of the cluster row. So we used cluster hyphen pod hyphen reader hyphen row. So we can see that more information about that, the name of the cluster role, and what is the verb we used, get and list on the pod resource, right? So next thing we can create the cluster role binding. So we can create another file cluster role binding dot YAML. Here I need to add the other YAML file detail. So the same procedure only, but only thing we need to say, like, the API version, the cluster role binding, the kind here, and the name of this cluster role binding is cluster or reader binding. In the subject and the role reference. In the subject, we need to refer the which service account is going to consume this, and to the role reference, which role we are going to use here. So service account, we already created the name called cluster pod -reader -sa, which is in the default namespace, and then the role reference, which role we are going to use. The name of the role is this one, right? And the API group. Save that. kubectl apply -f cluster role binding. Yes. kubectl get cluster role binding. You can see there are many, right? So we can just say that the name of that. We can say cluster hyphen pod hyphen reader hyphen binding. So we got the description about that. The few informations we can share, right? The name of that and the name of the role. So that is done. So next thing, we can create a pod using that. So just create another file, vimpod.yaml. In that, you can see here the API version v1, kind is pod, metadata in that, the name of the pod, and which service account we are going to use here, right? So that the service account we just now created, and that name we have to specify here, and the container, and the name of the container, and which image we are using, and the command to run this container, right? Save that. kubectl apply -f pod.yaml. kubectl describe get pods. kubectl describe pod and the pod name. So the curl cluster pod here. We can verify that the service account which has been used in this container. We can see here, right? The cluster pod -reader -sa. Now we can just log in inside the pod and we can verify that it's working fine as we expected, right? So we can log in inside the pod. We can just say that the pod name and exit command, enter. So I'm inside the pod now. Now, as I said, we need to run this two variables so that using that variable, we can run a curl command to list the pods from a paste. Now I can run the curl command to list the pods. So I hope you remember this command, curl -k, and the token is here. The token is this one, the file path, and the Kube API. So this is a Kube API server name. And we are going to see now the namespace, default namespace, the pods. So we are able to see the pods from the default namespace successfully. In the previous session also, we were able to see all this the same way. But we are currently using the cluster role and cluster binding, but earlier we were using the role and the role binding. So the difference, what I said, the role actually can read only from that particular namespace, like default namespace. But here, we are using the cluster role so that we can see that all the resources from the different namespaces. So for instance, if I create a kubectl, or even we can say that, I can say that again the token and the kube API, because once we exit from the pod, we need to run this commands rerun again. Otherwise, it will not work. Enter. Still, I'm able to see that. Even we can say a different namespace. It's called cube system, cube hyphen. I cannot run in this way. I have to put that command again. And it's not default. I need to say cube hyphen system. So I can see many parts from the cube hyphen system. So it's basically a different namespace, which is used for the Kubernetes components are running in this namespace, like control plane, scheduler, controller, etcd. All these services are running in this kube system namespace, so that we can see all the pods information from this namespace. But even if we run this command from that role and the role-based access, you will not be able to see this namespace content details. Now we are able to see that details because we are using the cluster role and the cluster binding, which means it's clusterly accessed. The role is only for namespace access. So that is the reason we can see all the namespaces can resources details. Thanks everyone. Thanks for this session. So I hope you have understand today's class. Let's see another topic.